As we start this demo, I'm going to go back to the home page. If we click on the little Scout icon here, you can see all of your applications that are running, as well as some overall metrics for that application. So we have, for our web endpoints, we have our response time and throughput. For our background jobs, we also have our execution time and throughput, as well as the total time consumed for your application, as well as when that application last reported. If we go back to our application, this is our overview page. And our overview page shows a brief overview of all of your performance metrics, time frame in our Insights tabs. So let's talk about the time frame first. On the top right-hand corner here, we can change the time frame for our metrics, going all the way up to 7 days, as low as 30 minutes, as well as playing around with ending earlier in the month with the end time, as well as that 7 days and 30 minutes with ending earlier. You can also compare your data to previous periods. So you can compare it to your previous period, yesterday, last week, and last month. If we look at what's happening yesterday, we can see that we have a couple of different lines here. The green will be the total, and it shows you the now versus that previous period that we selected. And the yellow would be the throughput for what we have selected here. And of course, that data from now versus that previous period of yesterday. As you can see on these metrics buttons, we have the changes in either your mean, response time, throughput, errors, and things like that in your comparison. If I turn off this comparison here, and we go back to just 3 days, let's talk about our interactive dashboard. With our interactive dashboard, you can highlight a particular time period on the graph itself and pull out web endpoints that saw higher response times. So if we find a spot like right over here where there's a big spike, we just drag and click, and all of the web endpoints will show up that have the highest response times. As you can see, when we click on this, the highlighted section of that graph carries down to each of these web endpoints, so you can really see which web endpoint might be causing that spike or might help cause that spike along with others. If we click into this one, which looks like it's a part of the culprit there, when we click into this endpoint, as you can see, that highlighted section carries through to the next page. All insights on the Performance Overview tab here, as well as the Traces tab over here, are based off of that highlighted time period. So by removing that highlight, the dashboard, as well as this Traces tab and the Performance Overview tab, will revert insights to that previously selected time frame. Up here in the top right corner, right now we have the last 3 days. If we go back to that overview page, let's talk a little bit more about our Insights dashboard. You can customize what you're seeing on our graph here by clicking through the different metrics buttons. We have the response time, which is the page load time for users. 95th, which is a different way of describing the response time. It measures the slowest 5% of web endpoints. The throughput, how many users are accessing your app over that certain time period. Again, we have the last 3 days. Errors and memory are pretty self-explanatory. They show your error and memory usage respectively. And the app dex, a number between 0 and 1, measuring customer satisfaction. The higher to number 1 you are, the better. As you can see here, right now we are on throughput. So that yellow line is going to depict how our throughput looks throughout this time period. But If we want to look at, for example, the 95th, as you can see, that yellow line is going to change. Same with memory. You can see as that changes over here, as well as the apdex, which will show you again for that certain time period. Next, we're going to dive down into the N+1 Insights tab. And this is where we can see various endpoints. We found an N+1 with the number of queries on the right, as well as how long those queries took. Now, it is important to note that with Scout, the time frame is going to pull insights over the past 24 hours. So once an N+1 is fixed, it may take some time to disappear from the list. It doesn't mean that N+1 was not fixed. So let's click into one of these. We're taken to a timeline view. Now, this timeline view is really helpful because you're able to see when an N+1 showed up, for example, after deploy. So as you can see with this timeline view right here, we have all of the endpoints that are called in succession to this endpoint up here at the top. And with that, as you can see, we have this little N+1 flag with the number of calls this layer took each time. For some of these, we also, on top of having a SQL button, which shows you the exact SQL query, we show everything except for we scrub data. So anything that has data in here will be shown with a question mark. We also have a backtrace button. And with the backtrace button, you're able to see the exact line of code of where this N+1 is happening. Now, right now, we can see the exact path and the line number, but we do have a GitHub integration that will actually pop up the exact line of code so you don't have to go and dig down yourself. It's very helpful, but of course, not necessary. We also currently have this in a condensed view, which just streamlines the relevant endpoints to the top. But if we click off of this condensed view, it shows you all of the endpoints in your application, just in case if you might want to dive down a little bit further into what's happening here. On this page, we have a couple other metrics that you can look at with your N+1s. For example, we have a summary view, which is a top-down summary of the time spent by your call with all of the layers here, and it kind of streamlines everything up to the top, showing you where those N+1s are, as well as how long each of those took. We also have a memory allocation breakdown here that again gives you that summary view of kind of what's happening with the number of allocations, where it's happening, as well as that timeline. And we also have a context tab where you can set up custom context, which I will talk about a little bit later, to get some more insights on where this N+1 is happening, to dive down and really figure out what the problem is. Going back to that overview page, another useful feature that our customers absolutely love is the Slow Query Insights tab. This tab will list all of the various slow queries present in your application, and just to note, these queries don't have to be slow either, as something could be taking up a lot of time within an endpoint or a background job. It looks like we just have one here, so let's check that out. Now, once we click into this slow query, we are taken into an endpoint and we can see the time it takes different traces within a single query. So as you can see here, it looks like we have 5 different queries going on that are linked, and we get that again entire SQL query here with all of the data scrubbed. But the awesome thing about this is we have these little call buttons underneath each of the queries. So it tells you the transaction traces of what's happening. So you can see maybe why one transaction took 5,000 milliseconds versus one that took 25,000 milliseconds. Now we can click into this here and we get that timeline view again, like we just saw with that SQL query, again, as a reminder, if we need to see what's happening, as well as that backtrace. So we can go and dive down and see where that slow query is happening and try to fix it. One more time, back to that overview page here. We also have a memory bloat insights tab, and this shows background jobs and endpoints where there is a noticeable memory increase. So this gives you a look at the memory usage before and after a request finishes. So let's click into one of these here. And if we click into one of these, again, we're taken to that memory allocation breakdown where you can see where the memory bloat might be happening. For this one, it's going to probably be happening in this layer right here, or even the one with 31 calls. We also have an Errors Insights tab, and this is just a snapshot of what you'll see on the errors page. It's going to just list all of your errors across all transactions for that set time period up here in the top right corner. Now, before we dive into all of the buttons up here, I'm going to highlight a time period where we saw a spike. Let's choose this one again. And let's go to the web endpoints page. The web endpoints page gives a list view of all of your web endpoints in your application, and it lists them in order of time consumed by the application. And time consumed is calculated by the response time times the throughput divided by all of your other endpoints. So a high time consumed web endpoint means that it's one of the most trafficked endpoints in your application, and therefore it's best to give attention to those endpoints to give the greatest impact to your users here. Now, as you can see that I highlighted that little section on the overview page, that highlight transfers over into all of these web endpoints. So you can really dive down and see what web endpoints in your application might be causing a spike, other than the ones that have that high time consumption, to really drill down and see kind of what's happening and what might be affecting your application the most. We also have a couple of other metrics here that you can look at besides time consumed. We can look at that response time with that graph, the throughput, the max allocations, as well as the error rate as well. And if we click into one of these web endpoints, it will take you back to that graph that we looked at the beginning of this presentation with the performance overview page and the traces tab. Now to the background jobs tab. This will show you the execution time and the throughput for your various background jobs. And as you can see here, it provides similar insights as the web endpoints tab. You can look at your execution time, throughput, latency, max allocations, and error rate. And just like that web endpoints page, as you can see, that highlight carried through, so you can dive in and see what background job might be holding up your application as well. Now, under the Services tab, we have two different sections, and I'm going to start with the Database tab. I'm also going to remove this highlight. And now we can see the full page. I'm going to talk about the Database tab. This is one of Scout's differentiators from our competitors. Our Database tab shows how your database performs in relation to your application. It lists queries based on time consumed, very similarly to that web endpoints page, but it's just essentially the throughput times the query time. And of course, it's going to provide insights on what a specific query is and where it occurred. So if we look down here, we have this entire table of all of your queries in order of time consumed here. And if we click onto one of these, we get that very similar look of the query statements, as well as all of the calls in the transaction traces. So you can, again, dive in and really see what's happening and maybe why this has the highest time consumption in your application. We also have a highlighting tool on this page, and the highlighting tool filters values on the database tab to just what you've highlighted. So let's highlight this spike here. Maybe we want to investigate this a little bit more. And as you can see, all of the queries that do not relate to this time period are grayed out. And by highlighting a section of your data right here, our platform will show the increase and decrease in the mean time of your highlighted time versus the rest of the timeline right now, the last 3 days. As you can see here, we have these little arrows next to throughput, mean, and 95th. That shows you either the increase or the decrease. It looks like this example is only an increase in the mean time. So again, you can see maybe what's affecting that spike, and also maybe the culprit of what's happening for that really big increase in throughput or mean time. We also have an external services page. And this is where you can deep dive to find important metrics in the amount of time spent in your API calls. So similarly to that database tab, you can highlight a section. As you can see, that highlight has carried through. And you can see more specifics on what API calls are happening within that time period. And you can also click into an endpoint to view its background jobs. All right, this needs to be edited out here. Sorry, guys. All right, we'll keep going. Now let's go to the traces page. And while this loads, I'm going to talk a little bit about custom context. So with the use of custom context, you can go further in understanding not only which developer road. Ooh, that doesn't look good. Sorry, guys, you're gonna have to edit that out as well. All right, have to switch to Scout's app here. So sorry, that's all gonna have to be edited out. Let me talk a little bit about custom context. With the use of custom context, you can go further in understanding not only which developer wrote a piece of code, but also how and which customers a specific query impacted. So establishing custom context enables you to define different values to better understand why a particular query was slow. That is just for your application alone. So the traces tab is where you can get an overview of the slowest web endpoint traces for your chosen time period. Again, right now we have the last 3 days up here in the top right corner, and your custom context parameters, which will show up here in these little boxes down below. Any additional data will appear on this page outside of Scout's out-of-the-box content as well. You can highlight and filter values on this page to see if different users, for example, are having a slower experience more consistently than others. So as you can see on these graphs, we can filter by, for example, response time. And maybe we're concerned about this 7,000 millisecond response time right here. If we drag and highlight, as you can see, on the left-hand side, we have the endpoints that are being affected by this response time, as well as with our custom context setup, we can see the user IP, URI, user ID, and things like that, where they are having that very slow response time. So we can again go in and say, hey, which users are actually being affected by this? And let's go fix it. And if I go to a little bit larger of a highlight here, we can also click on the different parameters in the custom context. If, for example, in our case, if we have a user that's having a really slow experience, for example, maybe this user email sends us an email and saying, hey, your website's really slow. We can click right on the user email. We can see their response times, their endpoints on what they're hitting and what might be the cause there, as well as the URIs that they're hitting over here, transaction IDs, and a little bit about them as well that we have set up, like their user ID and their organization ID as well. If I click out of this, lastly, we also have a list of all of the transaction traces at the bottom of the page. This is really helpful because you can see exactly when a transaction happened, where, how long, and things like that with the when, the endpoint, the URI, duration, memory allocations, and memory increase as well. So it's really nice to be able to dive in and see why maybe one of our web endpoints in our highlighted section is taking almost 3,000 milliseconds, maybe when we're not expecting it to. Now let's go to the errors page. The errors page shows your errors by both type and by endpoint. It shows, of course, the various times your app experienced an error, and you can drill down further by clicking the Explore button. But first, as you can see, we have this awesome graph on the left that shows the errors by type, and you can click through into this to filter out any type of error that you don't want to see. Same with the errors by endpoint. Again, if there's one that we know might be happening that we don't want to look at right now, or it's just going to occur no matter what, we can just click right out of that and the graph will change. Now, as we look at this table down here, you can see all of the errors as well as the number of times this error has occurred. So maybe there's one that you haven't seen before, but it's already happened, for example, 6 times. You can say, hey, like, where is this happening and why is this happening? So if we click on that Explore button, let's look at this one that happened 7 times. We can see the list of every time this error happened, where it's at, as well as the trace. We can also click into this error and we get some more information about it. So we get some request information here, as well as any custom context that we have set up that can give you a little bit more information on maybe who or what is causing this error, as well as that backtrace. Again, if we have the GitHub integration set up, you can just click on this plus, and once it fetches the code, it'll literally show you the line of code of where this is happening. So you don't have to dive into your IDE or wherever you store your code to find it. It'll just show you right here for quicker context on what's happening. Also, who wrote it, and maybe who updated it last. We also have some server environment data down here, if that is helpful, as well as some more information about this error when it happened, the first time it happened, a little graph of the last either 24 hours or 30 days of when this happened, as well as you're able to leave comments on this error if you want to go back and look at this later. The last thing I want to show you quickly is the alerting tab, where we can set up alerts. So if we click on alert conditions here, you can see that we can set up multiple alerts, but the best thing to look at is under our documentation, under the features tab. We go to features and then alerting. We have an entire list of all of the metrics that you can set up alerting for both web requests and background jobs, as well as information on how to set them up, what they're going to look like, as well as if we keep scrolling down here, we also have a list of our alerting integrations here. We have some pretty handy alerting integrations like Slack, PagerDuty, OpsGenie, and things like that, if that's what you like to use to set up your alerts. Now, on top of that, we also have integrations for error monitoring. So on top of Scout's error monitoring itself, you can add your integration for either Rollbar, Sentry, Honey Badger, or Bugsnag if there are some other metrics that you'd like to see as well. And lastly, we also do have instructions for that GitHub integration that I was talking about earlier.